The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Chun walked through the entrance of Riverside Academy for the first time. Her worn leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder and a manila folder containing her substitute teaching assignment clutched in her free hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the glass doors behind her, and a familiar scent of industrial floor cleaner mixed with teenage energy filled the air. She paused for a moment, taking in the bustling hallway where students rushed past in a blur of backpacks and animated conversations, their voices echoing off the polished linoleum floors. Sarah had seen worse places than this suburban high school. Much worse. The pristine hallways lined with academic achievement banners and college recruitment posters seemed almost quaint compared to the hostile environments she'd navigated during her 8 years with the Metropolitan SWAT unit. But those days were behind her now, buried beneath layers of trauma, counseling, and a desperate need for something approaching normalcy after the incident that ended her law enforcement career 6 months ago. The assignment was simple enough. Mrs. Rodriguez, the regular chemistry teacher, had called in sick with the flu, and Sarah would be covering her classes for the next 2 weeks. It wasn't her first choice of professions, but teaching offered something her previous job never could. The chance to build something positive instead of constantly tearing things down. The pay was terrible compared to her old salary, but money had never been her primary motivation anyway. She made her way to the main office, nodding politely to students who glanced her way with the typical mixture of curiosity and indifference that greeted all substitute teachers. The administrative assistant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, looked up from her computer screen with a welcoming smile. "You must be Ms. Chun," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. We spoke on the phone yesterday. Welcome to Riverside Academy." Sarah shook her hand firmly, noting the slight surprise that flickered across Mrs. Patterson's face at the strength of her grip. It was a reaction she'd grown accustomed to over the years. People expected teachers to have soft handshakes and gentle demeanors, not the calloused hands and alert posture that came from years of tactical training. "Thank you for having me," Sarah replied, keeping her voice warm and professional. "I'm looking forward to working with the students." Mrs. Patterson handed her a stack of papers, including class rosters, lesson plans, and a building map. Mrs. Rodriguez left detailed instructions for each class period. "Her room is 204, just up the stairs and down the hall to your right. The first bell rings in about 20 minutes, so you'll have time to get settled." As Sarah climbed the stairs to the second floor, she couldn't help but notice the way the building was laid out. Emergency exits every 50 feet, clear sight lines down the main corridors, and reinforced doors that could be locked from the inside. Old habits died hard, and even in this peaceful suburban setting, her mind automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes. Room 204 was a typical chemistry classroom with black-topped lab tables arranged in rows, a fume hood in the corner, and periodic table posters covering the walls. Sarah set her bag down on the teacher's desk and began reviewing Mrs. Rodriguez's lesson plans. The handwriting was neat and precise, with detailed notes about each student's progress and learning style. It was clear that Mrs. Rodriguez cared deeply about her students, and Sarah felt a responsibility to maintain that standard during her temporary tenure. The first bell rang, and within moments, the hallway outside erupted with the sound of locker doors slamming and teenage voices raised in conversation. Sarah positioned herself by the door, ready to greet her first class as they filed in. She'd learned during her brief stint as a substitute the previous month that establishing authority from the very first moment was crucial to maintaining classroom order. Her first period advanced chemistry class consisted of 22 seniors, most of whom appeared genuinely interested in the subject matter. They settled into their seats quickly, and Sarah was able to move through Mrs. Rodriguez's lesson on molecular bonding without any significant disruptions. A few students tested the boundaries with whispered conversations and phone checking, but a stern look and a pointed clearing of her throat was enough to redirect their attention. The second and third periods passed similarly smoothly. Sarah found herself enjoying the rhythm of teaching, the way complex concepts could be broken down into digestible pieces, and the satisfaction of seeing understanding dawn in a student's eyes. It reminded her why she'd originally planned to become a teacher before taking what was supposed to be a temporary detour into law enforcement fresh out of college. It was during the lunch break that she first became aware of the undercurrent of tension that seemed to flow through certain areas of the school. She was eating her sandwich in the faculty lounge when Mr. Williams, a veteran math teacher with 20 years of experience, struck up a conversation. "How's your first day going?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her with his coffee mug. "Pretty well," Sarah replied. The students seemed engaged, and Mrs. Rodriguez left excellent lesson plans. Mr. Williams nodded, but his expression grew more serious. "Just a heads up about fourth period. You've got the regular chemistry class, and there are a few students in there who can be challenging." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Challenging how?" "Let's just say they've made life difficult for several substitutes this year. 3 quit midday, and 1 actually requested a transfer to a different school district." Mr. Williams lowered his voice. "The administration knows about it, but these particular students have parents who donate heavily to the athletic program. Makes discipline a bit complicated." The familiar feeling of unease that Sarah had learned to trust during her SWAT days began to stir in her stomach. She'd dealt with difficult teenagers before, but something in Mr. Williams' tone suggested this was more than typical adolescent rebellion. "What kind of behavior are we talking about?" she asked. Mr. Williams glanced around the lounge to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Verbal intimidation, destruction of teaching materials, creating disruptions that make it impossible to conduct class. Nothing physical that can be proven, but they have ways of making it clear that they're in charge." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly. During her law enforcement career, she'd encountered plenty of bullies who used psychological tactics to control their victims. The settings might be different, but the fundamental dynamics remained the same. "Have any of the substitutes tried to file complaints?" she asked. "Sure, but it never seems to go anywhere. Principal Morrison is more concerned about maintaining the school's reputation and keeping the sports boosters happy than dealing with a few problem students." Mr. Williams finished his coffee and stood up. "Just be careful in there. And don't take anything they do personally." The afternoon bell rang, signaling the start of fourth period, and Sarah made her way back to room 204. She spent a few minutes reviewing the class roster, noting the names that Mr. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Williams had subtly emphasized during their conversation. Tyler Brooks, Jake Martinez, and Kevin Sullivan were all listed as members of the varsity football team, and according to Mrs. Rodriguez's notes, they consistently performed below their academic potential despite showing signs of intelligence. As students began filtering into the classroom, Sarah immediately identified the 3 boys from their confident swagger and the way other students seemed to give them a wide berth. Tyler was tall and broad-shouldered with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of cocky smile that suggested he'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Jake was shorter but stockier, with dark hair and calculating eyes that seemed to be constantly assessing his surroundings for opportunities to exploit. Kevin had the lean build of a runner and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the perpetual sneer that twisted his features. They took seats in the back corner of the classroom, deliberately ignoring Sarah's greeting as they sprawled in their chairs with exaggerated casualness. The other students settled in quietly, but there was a palpable tension in the air that Sarah recognized from her tactical days. It was the feeling of being in a room where violence might erupt at any moment, where everyone was waiting to see who would make the first move. Sarah decided to proceed with the lesson as planned, hoping that keeping the class focused on the subject matter might prevent any confrontations. She began explaining the day's topic, chemical reaction rates, writing key terms and formulas on the whiteboard while the majority of students took notes attentively. The rate of a chemical reaction depends on several factors, she explained, turning to face the class. Temperature, concentration of reactants, surface area, and the presence of catalysts all play important roles in determining how quickly. A loud bang interrupted her explanation as Tyler deliberately knocked his textbook to the floor. The sound echoed through the classroom like a gunshot, causing several students to jump and turn around to stare. Sarah paused mid-sentence, her hand still holding the dry erase marker as she assessed the situation. "Sorry," Tyler said with mock sincerity, making no move to pick up the book. "Guess my hand slipped." Sarah recognized the challenge for what it was. In her SWAT training, instructors had taught them about dominance displays and the importance of responding appropriately to establish authority. Too aggressive and you escalate unnecessarily. Too passive and you lose control of the situation. "Entirely. No problem," she said calmly, returning her attention to the whiteboard. "As I was saying, catalysts can significantly increase reaction rates by lowering the activation energy required." This time it was Jake who interrupted, letting out an exaggerated yawn that was loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Man, this is boring," he said to his friends, making no effort to lower his voice. "When are we going to learn something useful?" Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that used to flood her system before a high-risk operation. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, but every muscle in her body was coiled and ready for action. She'd learned long ago that bullies relied on getting an emotional reaction from their targets. The moment you showed fear or anger, you handed them the power they craved. "Chemistry is all around us," she replied evenly, continuing to write on the board. "The metabolism in your body, the fuel in your car, even the protein synthesis that builds muscle tissue are all examples of chemical reactions." Kevin snorted derisively. "Yeah, right. Like we're ever going to need to know about molecules and whatever after we graduate." Sarah turned to face the class again, her expression remaining neutral despite the growing disruption. She could see the discomfort in the other students' faces, the way they hunched down in their seats as if trying to become invisible. This was clearly a familiar pattern, and she suspected that many potentially good teachers had been driven away by exactly this kind of systematic harassment. "Actually," she said, addressing Kevin directly, "if you're planning to pursue athletics at the college level, understanding chemistry becomes quite important. Drug testing, nutrition science, and sports medicine all rely heavily on chemical principles." For a moment, Kevin looked genuinely interested, and Sarah thought she might have found a way to engage him constructively. But then Tyler jumped back into the conversation, clearly determined to maintain the confrontational atmosphere. "Yeah, well, maybe some of us have better things to do than memorize a bunch of formulas we'll never use," he said, leaning back in his chair until it balanced on two legs. "Besides, everyone knows substitutes don't really know what they're talking about anyway." The insult was deliberate and calculated, designed to undermine her authority in front of the entire class. Sarah had faced down armed suspects, negotiated with hostage-takers, and breached buildings filled with dangerous criminals, but something about the casual cruelty in Tyler's voice triggered a response that surprised her with its intensity. She set down her marker and turned to face him directly, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly into a more assertive stance. Years of tactical Training had taught her how to project authority without appearing threatening, and she drew on that knowledge now. "I've been teaching chemistry longer than you might think," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent classroom. "And I found that students who are truly confident in their abilities don't usually feel the need to disrupt others who are trying to learn." Tyler's chair came down with a sharp crack as he straightened up, his eyes narrowing with surprise and anger. He clearly hadn't expected the new substitute to push back against his dominance display, and for a moment, Sarah could see him recalculating his approach. "Oh, really?" he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "And what exactly is your background, Ms.? What was your name again?" "Ms. Chun," she replied, maintaining eye contact without blinking. "And my background is extensive enough to handle anything this classroom might present." The words carried a weight that went beyond their literal meaning, and Sarah saw something flicker in Tyler's eyes that might have been uncertainty. Jake and Kevin leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted but not quite understanding how. "Look, lady," Jake interjected, "we don't know what kind of schools you taught at before, but this is Riverside Academy. We do things a certain way here, and substitutes who don't respect that usually don't last very long." There it was. The threat delivered with just enough ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability, but clear enough that everyone in the room understood the implicit message. Sarah felt her tactical instincts fully engage, her mind automatically analyzing the positioning of all three boys, their likely physical capabilities, and the various options available to her if the situation escalated beyond words. But she also recognized that this was a crucial moment. How she responded now would determine not just her ability to control this particular class, but potentially her entire future at Riverside Academy. She could back down, try to placate them with a softer approach, and hope they would lose interest in tormenting her. Or she could stand her ground and risk whatever consequences might follow. "I appreciate you letting me know how things work here," she said, her voice remaining steady and professional. "But I think you'll find that I'm quite adaptable to different environments." She turned back to the whiteboard and continued writing the chemical equation she'd been explaining, but she kept her peripheral vision focused on the three boys in the back corner. She could feel the tension in the room ratcheting up another notch as they realized their intimidation tactics weren't having the desired effect. Kevin was the next to try a different approach. "You know, Ms. Chen," he said, pronouncing her name with exaggerated precision, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't you tell us a little about yourself? Where did you teach before coming here?" The question sounded casual enough, but Sarah recognized it as another probe, an attempt to gather information that could be used against her later. She'd seen interrogation techniques that used the same seemingly friendly approach to make subjects reveal more than they intended. "I've worked in various educational settings," she replied without turning around. "Now, let's get back to reaction rates. Can anyone tell me what happens to the rate of reaction when we increase the temperature?" A girl in the front row tentatively raised her hand. "The molecules move faster, so they collide more often?" "Exactly right, Emma," Sarah said, checking the name against her seating chart. "The increased kinetic energy leads to more frequent and more energetic collisions between reactant molecules." Tyler wasn't ready to let the academic discussion continue. "That's a pretty vague answer about your background," he said loudly. "What kind of educational settings? Elementary school? Community college? Or maybe you're just someone who couldn't cut it in a real career and decided to try teaching." The personal attack was designed to provoke an emotional response, and Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle over her as her training kicked in. During hostage negotiations, suspects often tried to get under negotiators' skin with personal insults and provocations. The key was to remain detached and focused on the objective while gathering intelligence about the subject's psychological state and motivations. My previous career prepared me quite well for dealing with challenging situations, she said, still facing the board, including situations where individuals attempt to use intimidation and disruption to avoid engaging with the material. She turned around and looked directly at Tyler. Now, since you seem particularly interested in my qualifications, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding of today's lesson by calculating the rate constant for this reaction. She gestured to the equation on the board, knowing full well that Tyler hadn't been paying attention to any of the academic content. It was a calculated move designed to shift the focus back to his academic performance rather than her personal history. Tyler stared at the board for a moment, his jaw working as he clearly struggled with the equation. The silence stretched out uncomfortably as it became obvious to everyone in the room that he had no idea how to solve the problem. "This is stupid," he finally muttered. "When are we ever going to need to know this garbage in real life?" "Well," Sarah said, moving closer to his desk, "if you're planning to pursue a career in law enforcement, for example, you'd need to understand chemical analysis for forensic evidence. If you're interested in emergency medicine, you'd need to know how drugs interact chemically in the human body. If you want to work in engineering, chemical processes are fundamental to manufacturing and material science." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Of course, if you're planning to make a living through intimidation and bullying, then you're right. Chemistry probably won't be very useful to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah had crossed a line from defensive responses to direct confrontation, and she could see the shock registering on the faces of students throughout the classroom. Jake and Kevin exchanged glances with Tyler, and Sarah could almost see them reassessing their strategy. "What did you just say?" Tyler asked, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level as he slowly stood up from his desk. Sarah felt time slow down the way it always had during high-stress tactical situations. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled, as every detail of the classroom became hyper-vigilant. She noted Tyler's clenched fists, the way Jake was positioning himself to flank her if she moved toward the door, and Kevin's hand reaching into his backpack for something she couldn't see. But she also noticed something else. The other students in the classroom weren't cowering anymore. Several of them were sitting up straighter, watching with a mixture of fear and fascination as someone finally stood up to the three bullies who had been terrorizing substitutes all year. "I said," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had once de-escalated armed standoffs, "that chemistry might not be useful if someone's career plan revolves around intimidating people who can't fight back." Tyler took a step toward her, his face flushing red with anger. "You don't know who you're messing with, lady. My dad is on the school board, and my uncle runs the biggest construction company in the county. One phone call from me, and you'll never work in this district again." Sarah almost smiled at the familiar pattern. Bullies always resorted to threats about their connections when direct intimidation failed. During her SWAT career, she'd arrested drug dealers who bragged about their political connections, gang members who claimed their lawyers would have them out in an hour, and white-collar criminals who insisted that their campaign contributions made them untouchable. "That's interesting," she said, maintaining her position even as Tyler moved closer. "Are you planning to have your father handle all your problems for the rest of your life? Or just the ones where you can't intimidate people into submission?" Jake stood up now too, clearly trying to present a united front with his friend. "Look, Ms. Chun, maybe you don't understand how things work around here, but there are consequences for people who don't know their place." The phrase sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She'd heard those exact words before, spoken by a domestic abuser who had barricaded himself in his house with his wife and children. That situation had ended with SWAT breaching the building and Sarah personally taking down a man who outweighed her by 80 pounds. And what consequences might those be? She asked, her voice dropping to the same quiet intensity she'd once used to convince armed suspects to surrender peacefully. Kevin finally spoke up from his position near the back wall. "Accidents happen," he said with a shrug that was meant to look casual. "Substitute teachers get overwhelmed, materials get damaged, classes become impossible to control. Sometimes people just decide that teaching isn't for them after all." There it was. The clear threat delivered with just enough ambiguity to maintain deniability, but specific enough that everyone in the room understood exactly what they were talking about. Sarah felt the last vestiges of her patience evaporate as her protective instincts fully engaged. These 3 boys had been systematically terrorizing teachers, disrupting the education of their classmates, and creating an environment of fear and intimidation that went against everything she believed education should represent. They were counting on her to be just another overwhelmed substitute who would either quit or learn to look the other way when they decided to flex their power. They had made a serious miscalculation. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level despite the fury building in her chest. "You 3 have been deliberately sabotaging substitute teachers, and you're now threatening to do the same to me if I don't allow you to disrupt my classroom and prevent your classmates from learning." Tyler smirked, apparently interpreting her calm tone as a sign of submission. "Hey, we're just letting you know how things work around here. You can either work with us or you can make things difficult for yourself. Your choice." Sarah nodded, slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "And you believe you can get away with this because your parents have money and influence in the community." "That's right," Jake added. "So maybe you should think about whether this job is really worth all the trouble we can cause you." The other students in the classroom sat frozen, watching this confrontation unfold with the fascination of witnesses to a train wreck. Some looked terrified, others seemed to be silently cheering for their substitute teacher, but all of them understood that they were seeing something unprecedented in their experience at Riverside Academy. Sarah looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the students who had been trying to learn despite the constant disruptions. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who had clearly cared deeply about these kids and had probably dealt with similar harassment from these same 3 boys. She thought about all the substitute teachers who had been driven away, and all the students who had been denied a proper education because 3 privileged bullies had never been held accountable for their actions. "You know what?" she said. Finally, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made several students sit up straighter in their seats. "I think you're absolutely right about one thing. This situation does require a choice." Tyler's smirk widened, clearly believing that he had successfully intimidated another substitute into submission. "Smart lady. I knew you'd see reason." "The choice I'm making," Sarah continued, taking a step toward Tyler that caused him to instinctively step backward, "is to not allow 3 spoiled teenagers to prevent me from doing my job." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of her words sank in. Tyler's smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine surprise and growing anger. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. This 18-year-old boy, who had probably never faced real consequences for his actions in his entire privileged life, was trying to threaten someone who had spent nearly a decade dealing with genuinely dangerous criminals. The gap between his perception of his own power and the reality of what actual intimidation looked like was so vast that it would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. "Actually," she said, her voice dropping to the kind of quiet intensity that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up, "I think you're the ones who have no idea what you're getting into." Something in her tone must have penetrated Tyler's overconfidence because his expression shifted from angry certainty to something approaching concern. Jake and Kevin seemed to sense the change in atmosphere as well, their aggressive postures becoming slightly more defensive. The bell rang, signaling the end of fourth period, but nobody moved. The entire classroom remained frozen in the moment, as if everyone understood that something significant was happening and they didn't want to miss the conclusion. "Class dismissed," Sarah said without taking her eyes off Tyler. "Everyone except Mr. Brooks, Mr. Martinez, and Mr. Sullivan. You three gentlemen and I need to have a more detailed conversation about classroom expectations." The other students began gathering their belongings, but their movements were slow and deliberate as they clearly wanted to witness whatever was about to happen. Sarah could see the mixture of fear and anticipation on their faces as they reluctantly filed out of the room. "Actually," Tyler said, shouldering his backpack with exaggerated casualness, "we've got weight training next period. Can't be late for that." It was a direct challenge to her authority, a public test to see if she would back down when confronted with open defiance. Sarah recognized it as the moment that would define every interaction she had with these three boys for the rest of her time at Riverside Academy. "Weight training can wait," she said, moving to position herself between the three boys and the door. "This conversation cannot," Kevin snorted. "You can't keep us here against our will. That's like kidnapping or something." Sarah almost smiled at his legal analysis. "Actually, as the supervising adult in this classroom, I have both the authority and the responsibility to address behavioral issues that disrupt the learning environment. You're welcome to call your parents to discuss it with them if you'd like." The mention of involving their parents caused a flicker of uncertainty to cross all three faces. Despite their earlier threats about family connections, they clearly weren't eager to have this particular conversation with their influential relatives. "Look," Jake said, trying a different approach, "maybe we can work something out. We don't really want to cause trouble for you. We just need to know that you're not going to make problems for us either." It was a negotiation tactic, an attempt to find middle ground that would allow both sides to save face. During her SWAT career, Sarah had participated in countless negotiations with criminals who used similar language when they realized that their initial intimidation attempts had failed. "What kind of problems are you worried about me making?" she asked, genuinely curious about their perspective. Tyler and Kevin looked at Jake, apparently designating him as their spokesman. "We just need some flexibility sometimes," he said carefully. "Maybe we need to leave class early for team meetings, or we're too tired to participate after a big game, stuff like that." Sarah nodded as if considering his words seriously. "And in exchange for this flexibility, you'll stop disrupting my classes and allow your classmates to learn?" "Exactly," Jake said, relief evident in his voice. "We can all get along if we just understand each other." It was a reasonable-sounding proposal on the surface, but Sarah recognized it for what it really was, an attempt to institutionalize their privileged status and ensure that they would never be held to the same standards as other students. They weren't looking for accommodation. They were demanding exemption from rules and consequences. "That's an interesting offer," she said, walking back to her desk and leaning against it in a casual pose that belied the steel in her voice. "But I'm afraid I can't accept it." The three boys exchanged glances, clearly not having anticipated this response. They had probably used this same negotiation strategy successfully with other teachers and substitutes, trading a reduction in overt disruption for tacit permission to ignore academic expectations. "Why not?" Tyler demanded, his attempt at diplomacy immediately abandoned. "It's a fair deal. We stay quiet. You don't hassle us about stupid homework and tests." "Because," Sarah said, her voice hardening, "your education isn't optional, and my job isn't to enable your sense of entitlement." She straightened up, and the three boys suddenly seemed to realize that this small woman possessed a presence that filled the entire room. "You want to know what my background is? I spent 8 years working with people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. People who believed that intimidation and threats could get them whatever they wanted. People who assumed that everyone around them was too weak or too scared to stand up to them. Tyler's face was flushing red again, but this time Sarah could see genuine uncertainty beneath the anger. "You're just a teacher," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "I'm a teacher now," Sarah agreed. "But before that, I was part of a tactical unit that specialized in dealing with individuals who had convinced themselves they were above the law." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Sarah watched as the three boys processed the implications of what she had just revealed. Jake's mouth fell open slightly. Kevin took an involuntary step backward, and Tyler's aggressive posture deflated like a punctured balloon. You were a cop?" Kevin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "SWAT," Sarah corrected, and the single word seemed to hit them with the force of a physical blow. She had crossed another line by revealing her background, but something about these three boys had triggered every protective instinct she possessed. They reminded her too much of the entitled criminals she had dealt with during her law enforcement career. People who used their privilege as a weapon against those they perceived as weaker or more vulnerable. The silence that followed stretched out until it became uncomfortable. Sarah could see the boys' minds racing as they tried to reconcile their image of a substitute teacher with the reality of someone who had been trained to handle genuinely dangerous situations. That doesn't change anything," Tyler finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're still just a substitute. You'll be gone in 2 weeks and we'll still be here." It was a valid point, and Sarah knew that her temporary status at the school did limit her options for creating lasting change. But she also knew that 2 weeks could be enough time to establish patterns and precedents that would outlast her presence. "You're right," she said. "I am just a substitute, and I will be gone soon. But while I'm here, you're going to follow the same rules as every other student in this school." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. "And what are you going to do if we don't? Arrest us?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the kind of intense focus she had once used to read the body language of armed suspects. "I don't have the authority to arrest you," she said quietly. "But I do have the training to recognize threatening behavior, document it properly, and ensure that the appropriate authorities are notified." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees as the implications of her words sank in. These boys had been operating under the assumption that their behavior would be protected by their family's influence and the school's desire to avoid controversy. But they were beginning to realize that someone with law enforcement training might view their actions very differently than overwhelmed substitute teachers had in the past. "You can't prove anything," Kevin said, but his voice shook slightly. "It's your word against ours, and our families have been supporting this school for years." Sarah reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a small digital recorder, holding it up so all three boys could see it clearly. "Actually, I've been documenting everything since the conversation began. Your threats about making my life difficult, your admission that you've been sabotaging other teachers, and your attempts to negotiate exemptions from academic requirements." Tyler's face went completely white. "You can't record us without permission. That's illegal." "In this state," Sarah said calmly, "only one party needs to consent to audio recording. And as the supervising adult in this classroom, I have both the legal right and the professional obligation to document threatening behavior directed at school personnel." She could see panic beginning to set in as the three boys realized that their carefully constructed system of intimidation was collapsing around them. They had counted on operating in the shadows, using plausible deniability and their family's influence to escape consequences for their actions. "Besides," Sarah continued, sliding the recorder back into her bag, "I'm not particularly interested in getting you arrested. I'm interested in getting you educated." The unexpected shift in her tone seemed to catch them off guard. They had been bracing for punishment and consequences, But her offer of a different path forward was clearly not something they had anticipated. "What do you mean?" Jake asked suspiciously. Sarah moved back to the whiteboard and picked up her marker. "I mean that you three are clearly intelligent enough to understand complex social dynamics and sophisticated enough to manipulate administrative systems. Those are actually valuable skills that could be channeled into productive directions." She began writing on the board again, this time creating a simple chart with 2 columns. "You have a choice to make. You can continue down the path you're on, where you use intimidation and family connections to avoid real challenges and genuine growth. Or you can accept that someone finally sees through your act and start developing the kind of character that will actually serve you in the real world." Tyler stared at the board, his expression cycling through anger, confusion, and something. That might have been curiosity. What kind of character? "The kind that doesn't need to threaten substitute teachers to feel powerful," Sarah replied. "The kind that can handle being challenged academically without lashing out. The kind that other people respect instead of fear." She turned back to face them, her expression softer but still serious. "I've worked with gang members who had more genuine courage than what you three have shown me today. They at least faced real consequences for their choices and dealt with actual threats to their safety. You're just bullying people who can't fight back because you're afraid of discovering that you might not be as special as everyone has told you." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Sarah could see the impact registering on their faces as she challenged not just their behavior but their fundamental self-image. They had probably never had an adult speak to them with such direct honesty about their character and motivations. "That's not..." Tyler started to protest, but his voice trailed off as he seemed to realize that any denial would only prove her point. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "For the remainder of my time here, you're going to attend class, participate in discussions, complete your assignments, and treat your classmates with respect. You're going to discover what it feels like to be held to the same standards as everyone else." Kevin found his voice again. "And if we don't?" Sarah's expression hardened again. "Then you'll discover what it feels like to have someone with actual experience dealing with threats and intimidation, documenting your behavior and presenting it to people who won't be impressed by your last names or your parents' donation records." She moved closer to them, and all 3 boys instinctively took a step backward. "I've testified in federal court against organized crime figures. I've written reports that sent armed drug dealers to prison for decades. Do you really think I'd have any trouble building a case against 3 high school bullies?" The weight of Sarah's words settled over the classroom like a heavy blanket. For the first time since she'd arrived at Riverside Academy, the 3 boys who had terrorized countless substitutes stood in complete silence, their usual arsenal of threats and intimidation tactics rendered useless against someone who had faced genuinely dangerous adversaries. Tyler was the first to break the silence, but his voice had lost all of its earlier bravado. "You can't just change everything because you used to be a cop," he said, though the words sounded more like a question than a statement. Sarah studied his face, noting the way his hands had unconsciously moved to his sides in a less aggressive posture. During her years in law enforcement, she had learned to read body language as precisely as other people read facial expressions. And what she saw in Tyler's stance told her that his psychological armor was beginning to crack. "I'm not changing anything," she replied calmly. "I'm simply enforcing the standards that should have been in place all along. The difference is that I have the experience and training to recognize manipulation tactics when I see them." Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if calculating whether he could make it past Sarah and escape this increasingly uncomfortable conversation. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot." "We don't want any trouble." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. These 3 boys had built their entire high School careers around creating trouble for anyone who dared to challenge their sense of entitlement. But now they were claiming they wanted to avoid conflict. "Trouble has already found you," she said quietly. "The question is whether you're going to face it honestly or continue hiding behind your parents' influence." Kevin finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from US?" It was the first genuine question any of them had asked, and Sarah recognized it as a potential turning point. During hostage negotiations, there was always a moment when the subject stopped making demands and started asking questions. It usually meant they were beginning to realize that their situation was more serious than they had initially understood. "I want you to discover what you're actually capable of when you stop wasting your energy on intimidating people who can't fight back," Sarah replied. "I want you to find out whether there's anything underneath all that bluster that's worth developing." She moved back to her desk and pulled out Mrs. Rodriguez's gradebook, flipping through the pages until she found their names. "According to these records, all three of you are capable of B-level work when you actually apply yourselves. But your current grades suggest that you've decided academic achievement is beneath you." Tyler's jaw tightened as he realized she was reviewing their academic performance in front of each other. "Grades don't matter if you're going to play college football," he muttered. "Really?" Sarah asked, looking up from the grade book with genuine curiosity. "What happens if you get injured? What happens if you're not quite good enough for a Division I scholarship? What happens if you make it to college but can't maintain the academic requirements to stay eligible?" The questions hung in the air, like physical challenges, forcing all three boys to confront possibilities they had probably never seriously considered. Their entire identities seemed to be built around their athletic abilities and social status, leaving them vulnerable to any threat to those foundations. "That's not going to happen," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah nodded toward the periodic table poster on the wall. "The same chemical processes that build muscle tissue also break it down when it's damaged. The same physics principles that govern throwing and running also determine impact forces and collisions. The mathematical concepts you're avoiding in your other classes are fundamental to understanding statistics, game strategy, and performance analysis." She could see them processing this information, perhaps for the first time recognizing connections between their athletic interests and the academic subjects they had dismissed as irrelevant. "But more importantly," Sarah continued, "the character traits required for genuine academic achievement are the same ones that separate good athletes from great ones. Discipline, persistence, the ability to learn from failure, respect for coaching and instruction." Kevin looked genuinely confused. "But we're already successful athletes. We're starters on varsity teams." Sarah felt a familiar sadness as she recognized the fundamental misunderstanding that had probably shaped these boys' entire educational experience. "Being physically gifted and being successful are not the same thing," she said gently. "Success requires developing your potential, not just coasting on natural ability." She closed the grade book and leaned against her desk, studying their faces. "How many of your teammates actually respect you? Not fear you, not tolerate you because you're useful to the team, but genuinely respect you as people?" The question clearly hit home in a way that academic challenges hadn't. Tyler's face flushed, Jake looked down at his shoes, and Kevin's mouth opened and closed as if he wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. "How many of your classmates would choose to spend time with you if you weren't athletes? How many teachers enjoy having you in their classes? How many adults in this building see you as anything more than problems to be managed?" Each question was delivered with surgical precision, targeting the insecurities that lay beneath their aggressive facades. Sarah had learned during her law enforcement career that truly changing someone's behavior required addressing their underlying motivations, not just threatening them with consequences. "That's not fair," Tyler said, but his voice was barely audible. "Life isn't fair," Sarah replied. but it is honest. And right now, your behavior is earning you exactly the kind of relationships and reputation you deserve. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the parking lot where expensive cars spoke to the economic privilege these boys took for granted. You want to know what real power looks like? It's not the ability to intimidate people who can't fight back. It's not having parents who can make your problems disappear. It's not being physically stronger or socially connected. She turned back to face them, and her voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made them lean forward despite themselves. Real power is having people trust you with important responsibilities because they know you'll handle them with integrity. It's being able to influence situations through competence and character rather than threats and manipulation. It's knowing that your success comes from what you've built, not what you've torn down. Jake swallowed hard. His earlier defiance completely evaporated. If we wanted to change things, how would we even start? Sarah felt a flicker of hope at the question. During her SWAT career, she had seen hardened criminals experience moments of genuine self-reflection that led to real transformation. It was rare, but it happened often enough to remind her that people were capable of growth, even in the most unlikely circumstances. You start by telling the truth, she said simply. To yourselves first, and then to the people you've hurt. Kevin looked skeptical. What truth? That you've been using intimidation to avoid finding out whether you're actually capable of meeting real challenges. That you've been hiding behind your privilege because you're afraid of discovering your limitations. That you've been treating other people badly because it made you feel powerful in a situation where you actually felt powerless. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Sarah could see them struggling with the cognitive dissonance between their self-image and the reality she was forcing them to confront. But what if we try and we're not as smart as we think we are? Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the most honest thing any of them had said since the conversation began, and Sarah felt her heart soften slightly as she recognized the vulnerability beneath his question. Then you'll find out what it actually means to work hard for something that matters, she replied. And you'll discover that intelligence isn't fixed. It's something you develop through effort and practice, just like athletic ability. She moved back to the whiteboard and began writing again, this time creating a simple timeline. Mrs. Rodriguez will be back in 2 weeks. That gives us 10 school days to establish new patterns and expectations. Jake looked at the timeline with obvious anxiety. 10 days to what? To find out whether you're willing to do the work required. To become the kind of people others respect instead of fear, Sarah said. To discover whether you can handle being held to the same standards as everyone else. To see if you're capable of genuine achievement rather than just getting by on privilege and intimidation. She turned back to face them, her expression serious, but not unkind. This is your opportunity to write a different story about who you are and what you're capable of. But it requires giving up the illusion that you're entitled to special treatment. Tyler stared at the timeline for a long moment. Before speaking, what happens if we can't do it? What happens if we try and we fail? Sarah recognized the question as coming from a place of genuine fear rather than defiance. These boys had probably spent their entire academic careers avoiding situations where failure was possible, which meant they had never developed the resilience that comes from overcoming real challenges. Then you'll have learned something valuable about the difference between failure and giving up, she said. Failure is a temporary setback that provides information about what you need to work on. Giving up is a permanent choice that closes off possibilities for growth. She paused, letting her words sink in. But I don't think you're going to fail. I think you're going to discover that you're capable of much more than you've been willing to attempt. Kevin looked confused. Why do you think that? Because the same intelligence you've been using to manipulate situations and avoid consequences could be redirected towards solving complex problems and mastering difficult concepts. The same social awareness you've used to identify and exploit weaknesses in other people could help you understand diverse perspectives and build genuine relationships. Sarah moved closer to them, her voice taking on an encouraging tone. The same determination you've shown in athletics could be applied to academic challenges. The same leadership abilities you've demonstrated in organizing intimidation campaigns could be used to create positive change in your school community. For the first time since the conversation began, she saw something like hope flicker across their faces. They were beginning to understand that she wasn't just criticizing their current behavior, but pointing toward a different way of being in the world. "It won't be easy," she continued. "You'll have to give up the comfortable certainty that you can always fall back on threats and privilege. You'll have to risk discovering that some things are harder than you expected. You'll have to deal with the fact that some people might not immediately trust your commitment to change." Jake nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the full scope of what she was proposing. "You're asking us to basically start over." "I'm asking you to start," Sarah corrected. "What you've been doing up until now isn't building toward anything meaningful. It's just a more sophisticated version of playground bullying." She returned to her desk and pulled out 3 sheets of paper, writing their names at the top of each one. "Here's how this is going to work. Each of you is going to complete every assignment, participate constructively in every class discussion, and treat every classmate with respect." Tyler looked at the paper with his name on it as if it were a legal document. "And if we do all that, then you'll have taken the first steps toward becoming the kind of people you have the potential to be," Sarah replied. "And I'll write recommendations for your college applications that focus on your growth and character development rather than just your athletic achievements." The offer clearly surprised them. They had probably expected punishment and consequences, not support and encouragement for positive change. "But if you choose to continue down the path you've been on," Sarah continued, her voice hardening slightly, "then you'll discover what it feels like to face real accountability for your actions." She handed each of them their paper and watched as they read the detailed expectations she had written out. Academic engagement, respectful behavior, constructive participation, and personal responsibility were clearly outlined with specific examples and measurable criteria. "This is like a contract," Kevin observed. "It is a contract," Sarah confirmed. "Your signature means you're committing to holding yourself to a higher standard. My signature means I'm committing to supporting your growth and documenting your progress accurately." Tyler stared at the paper for a long moment before looking up at her. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to us?" It was the most perceptive question any of them had asked, and Sarah took a moment to consider her answer carefully. "Because I've seen what happens when intelligent, capable people waste their potential on destructive behavior. I've arrested teenagers who started exactly where you are now and ended up destroying their lives and hurting innocent people." She paused, thinking about the cases that still haunted her from her law enforcement days. "But I've also seen people turn their lives around when someone finally held them accountable while still believing in their capacity for growth." Jake was studying his contract with obvious internal conflict. "What if people don't believe we're serious about changing?" "Then you'll have to prove it through consistent action over time," Sarah replied. "Trust isn't something you can demand or negotiate for. It's something you earn through reliability and integrity." She moved to the board again and wrote a single word in large letters: integrity. "This is the foundation of everything else we're going to work on," she said. "Integrity means doing the right thing even when it's difficult, even when no one is watching, even when it costs you something you want." Kevin looked at the word with obvious discomfort. "That sounds really hard." "It is hard," Sarah agreed. "That's what makes it valuable. Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy and convenient." Character is revealed by what you choose to do when the right thing requires sacrifice. She turned back to face them, her expression serious but hopeful. The question you need to answer, each for yourself, is whether you want to be the kind of people who are remembered for what you built or what you tore down. Tyler took a deep breath and picked up a pen from her desk. If I sign this, what happens to everything that came before? Sarah considered the question carefully, recognizing that he was asking about both consequences and redemption. What came before becomes the foundation for what comes next. You can't erase the past, but you can learn from it and choose a different direction going forward. She watched as Tyler slowly signed his name to the contract, followed by Jake and then Kevin. Their signatures were tentative, as if they weren't quite sure what they were committing to, but they were genuine. "Congratulations," Sarah said, collecting the signed contracts. "You've just taken the first step toward discovering who you really are when you stop hiding behind fear and privilege." As the three boys gathered their belongings to leave for their next class, Sarah could see the mixture of uncertainty and anticipation on their faces. They were clearly struggling to reconcile their new commitments with their established identities, but she had seen enough genuine moments of self-reflection to believe that real change was possible. "Ms. Chun," Tyler said as he reached the door, "what made you decide to become a teacher after being in SWAT?" Sarah paused, considering how much of her personal story to share. "I realized that the most important battles aren't fought with weapons and tactical gear. They're fought in classrooms and communities, one person at a time, by people who refuse to give up on the possibility that everyone can grow and change." After they left, Sarah stood alone in the empty classroom, feeling the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that came after high-stakes confrontations. She had taken a significant risk by revealing her background and challenging these boys so directly, but something about their situation had triggered every protective instinct she possessed. She thought about the other students in the class who had witnessed the confrontation, and how their reactions would ripple throughout the school community. Word would spread quickly that the new substitute teacher was different from the others, that she couldn't be intimidated or manipulated into looking the other way. The real test would come in the days ahead as Tyler, Jake, and Kevin either rose to meet the challenges she had set for them or reverted to their familiar patterns of intimidation and avoidance. Sarah had given them a clear choice and the tools. They needed to make positive changes, but ultimately the decision was theirs to make. As she prepared for her next class, Sarah reflected on the conversation that had just taken place and the potential consequences of her actions. She had crossed several professional boundaries by revealing her law enforcement background and confronting the boys so directly, but she had also created an opportunity for genuine transformation that might not have existed otherwise. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating the periodic table posters and chemistry equipment that surrounded her. In a few hours, she would return to her small apartment and the quiet life she had built since leaving the SWAT unit. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, standing guard over the possibility that three young men might choose to become better versions of themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.